Apologize to my sister or get out of my house!
I could not believe my ears, so I stood up and left.
My husband slammed his hand against our dining room table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses, looked me directly in the eye in front of his entire extended family, and told me that I needed to apologize to his sister immediately or get out of his house. I set down my fork slowly, looked around that table at faces I'd known for nearly 6 years, faces that offered absolutely no objection whatsoever to what Callum had just demanded, and I stood up. I didn't apologize. I didn't argue. I simply gathered my purse, walked out the front door, and drove away into the night, leaving behind a husband who genuinely believed, watching my taillights disappear down our street, that I would be calling within the hour, desperate and apologetic. Stick with me, because Callum had no idea exactly how permanently that specific dinner would end up reshaping both our marriage and his own comfortable assumptions about whose house that actually was. My name is Everly Camden. I'm 30 years old, and for 6 years I've been married to Callum Danvers, a man whose loyalty toward his own family, particularly his younger sister Thessaly, had gradually, over the course of our marriage, developed into a pattern where my own legitimate concerns and boundaries consistently ranked considerably lower than whatever Thessaly happened to want or need during any given family conflict. That specific dinner had begun ordinarily enough. Our extended family gathered for a monthly tradition Callum's parents had maintained for years, before Thessaly brought up, unprompted and with visible calculation, a financial disagreement from several months earlier where I declined to co-sign a loan for her struggling small business, a decision I'd made carefully and reasonably given both my own financial responsibilities and Thessaly's own demonstrated pattern of unreliable repayment. Throughout previous smaller loans our family had extended her over the years, Callum's demand that evening, delivered with such public humiliating force, represented simply the most extreme undeniable expression of a pattern that had shaped our entire marriage, one where his own family's comfort and Thessaly's particular demands had always, somehow, taken precedence over any genuine partnership or mutual respect within our actual marriage itself. Thessaly, 27, 4 years younger than Callum, had always occupied a particular position of protected favor within the Danvers family, a pattern that predated my own marriage into their family considerably, one Callum's own parents had apparently cultivated throughout both their children's entire upbringing, extending Thessaly considerably more indulgent treatment and forgiveness for various mistakes and poor decisions than they'd ever similarly extended toward Callum himself. I'd noticed this pattern developing clearly throughout our years of marriage, Thessaly's various business ventures failing repeatedly, each failure met with renewed family financial support rather than any genuine accountability, a cycle that had already, by the time of that devastating dinner, cost our own immediate family finances considerably given Callum's own repeated, quiet contributions toward covering his sister's accumulated debts. I'd raised concerns about this pattern directly with Callum on several previous occasions throughout our marriage, conversations that typically ended with him defending his family's approach as simply reflecting genuine, unconditional family loyalty, language that consistently positioned my own reasonable financial concerns as somehow less legitimate or important than whatever Thessaly's latest need happened to represent. That specific loan request, roughly 4 months before the devastating dinner, had represented a considerably larger amount than Thessaly's previous requests, nearly $15,000 toward yet another business venture I genuinely doubted would succeed given her demonstrated pattern throughout previous smaller ventures, a doubt I'd expressed clearly and reasonably when Callum first approached me about potentially co-signing that specific loan alongside him. I declined to co-sign that loan clearly and calmly during a private conversation with Callum months before that devastating dinner, explaining my genuine concerns regarding both our own financial stability and Thessaly's demonstrated pattern of business failures, concerns I believed, at the time, Callum genuinely understood and respected given his own initial measured response to my explanation. "I get it," he told me during that original conversation. "It's a lot of money, and she hasn't exactly had the best track record. I'll figure something else out for her." I genuinely believe that conversation represented a settled, mutually understood decision, entirely unprepared for Thessaly raising the entire situation again, unprompted and with visible calculation, during what should have been an ordinary family dinner months later, clearly hoping that public pressure might accomplish what her brother's private request had apparently failed to secure. "I just think it's really disappointing," Thessaly said that evening, her voice carrying a practiced, wounded quality directed toward the surrounding table rather than toward me specifically, that family doesn't feel like they can count on each other when it really matters. I guess some people just aren't as committed to this family as the rest of us. Callum's reaction to Thessaly's calculated comment revealed, with devastating clarity, exactly how thoroughly his own family loyalty could override even conversations we'd previously, privately settled together as partners. Rather than defending our earlier private agreement, or even simply remaining neutral while Thessaly pursued her calculated appeal, Callum turned toward me directly, his expression carrying a fury I recognized as genuinely mortifying given the entire extended family witnessing this specific confrontation unfold. "You need to apologize to her," he said, his voice carrying an authority that clearly expected immediate, unquestioning compliance. "Right now at this table. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes family gatherings so uncomfortable, and I'm done with it." I sat there, genuinely stunned, processing both the specific demand itself and the devastating recognition that Callum had apparently decided, in that exact moment, to prioritize his sister's manufactured public grievance over an agreement we'd privately, reasonably reached together months earlier as husband and wife. "I'm not apologizing for a decision we already discussed and agreed on," I told him, my voice carrying a calm I genuinely didn't feel given the mounting tension throughout that entire table. Callum's response, delivered with a finality that revealed exactly how thoroughly he'd apparently already decided how this specific confrontation needed to conclude, struck me with a force considerably beyond his earlier anger. "Then get out of my house," he said. "I mean it, Everly. Apologize or leave." I remember the specific, disorienting silence that settled over that entire table following Callum's devastating ultimatum, several relatives exchanging visibly uncomfortable glances, none of them offering any genuine objection whatsoever to what he just demanded in front of the entire family. I set down my fork slowly, processing genuine devastation alongside a growing, crystallizing clarity regarding exactly what this specific moment actually represented. My own husband choosing his sister's manufactured grievance over our marriage's basic mutual respect, publicly humiliating me rather than offering even minimal support or neutrality during a conflict he genuinely knew, given our earlier private conversation, had already been reasonably, fairly resolved between us. I stood up from that table, gathering my purse with hands that remained remarkably steady given the emotional intensity of everything unfolding around me. I didn't offer any dramatic parting words or extended explanation. I simply walked toward the front door, aware of Callum calling my name behind me, his voice carrying genuine surprise rather than any apparent reconsideration of his devastating demand. I drove away from that house that evening with tears finally falling once I'd put sufficient distance between myself and that entire devastating scene, processing both immediate, raw hurt and a deeper, more significant recognition regarding exactly what our marriage's actual power dynamics had apparently genuinely become throughout our 6 years together. I stayed with my closest friend Maricela O'Yelleran that first night, processing genuine shock and devastation regarding everything that had just unfolded, understanding clearly that this specific confrontation represented something considerably more significant than simply an isolated, unfortunate family conflict. Callum called repeatedly throughout that first evening and the following morning, his voicemail shifting gradually from initial confused frustration into something considerably more genuinely concerned as my continued silence apparently began, slowly, prompting real reflection regarding exactly what his devastating ultimatum had actually demanded of me. I didn't respond to those initial calls, understanding that I genuinely needed time and emotional distance to process both the specific incident itself and the broader pattern it had so devastatingly confirmed throughout our entire marriage, a pattern where his own family's demands had always, somehow, taken precedence over our actual partnership's basic mutual respect and consideration. I consulted directly with a marriage counselor, Dr. Priya Van Tassel, independently during those first difficult days, working through my own complicated emotions and beginning to genuinely clarify exactly what I needed from Callum, and from our marriage more broadly, before I would be willing to consider any potential reconciliation or return home. I finally agreed to meet with Callum directly roughly a week after that devastating dinner, choosing a neutral coffee shop rather than either of our own homes, wanting genuine, careful conversation rather than any emotionally charged confrontation within a space that might complicate our ability to communicate honestly and directly. "I need you to understand something clearly," I told him, my voice carrying a steady resolve I'd spent considerable time preparing throughout that preceding week. What you did at that dinner wasn't just embarrassing. It revealed something genuinely troubling about how you actually view our marriage compared to your relationship with your family. You publicly humiliated me over a decision we'd already privately, reasonably agreed on together, specifically because your sister applied pressure in front of an audience. Callum listened throughout that conversation with genuine visible discomfort, acknowledging directly, for what felt like the first time throughout our entire marriage, the actual pattern I described. I've spent my whole life being taught that family loyalty means never letting Thessaly feel like she's less important, he admitted. I think I never really examined how thoroughly that pattern was affecting our own marriage, until you actually walked out that door. I told him clearly that rebuilding our marriage would require considerably more than this single acknowledgement, that it would need to involve genuine, demonstrated change regarding how he balanced his family relationships against our own partnership's basic mutual respect. Change that would need to include directly addressing Thessaly's specific pattern of manipulative behavior, rather than simply continuing to accommodate it indefinitely. Callum and I worked together over the following months, alongside continued counseling sessions with Dr. Van Tassel, to establish considerably clearer boundaries regarding both our own marriage's basic mutual respect and his family's specific pattern of financial and emotional manipulation, particularly regarding Thessaly's demonstrated history of leveraging family gatherings and guilt to secure whatever she happened to want in any given moment. Callum had a direct, difficult conversation with Thessaly roughly 2 months after that devastating dinner, addressing clearly the specific pattern of public manipulation she'd employed regarding the loan disagreement, a conversation that, according to Callum's own account, initially met considerable resistance and defensiveness from Thessaly before eventually settling into something resembling genuine, if reluctant, acknowledgement. I noticed genuine, meaningful shifts in Callum's behavior throughout subsequent family gatherings, his willingness to directly address inappropriate comments or pressure from Thessaly or other family members, considerably more consistent than his previous pattern of conflict avoidance had ever demonstrated throughout our earlier years of marriage. I maintained careful, appropriate distance from Thessaly specifically throughout that entire period, understanding that rebuilding any genuine trust with her would require considerably more sustained, demonstrated change than a single difficult conversation with her brother could reasonably provide. Thessaly's specific business venture, the one she'd originally requested the substantial loan toward funding, ultimately failed within the following year regardless, confirming the exact concerns I'd originally raised months before that devastating dinner, a failure that occurred without my own or Callum's direct financial involvement given our earlier, reasonable decision not to co-sign that specific loan. I learned, through occasional updates from extended family members, that Thessaly had subsequently pursued financial support from several other relatives following that venture's failure, requests that met with considerably more resistance and skepticism than her previous pattern had typically generated, several family members apparently having grown increasingly aware, following our own specific confrontation, of exactly how consistently Thessaly's manipulative approach toward securing family financial support had actually operated throughout recent years. Thessaly reached out to me directly roughly 8 months after that devastating dinner, offering an apology that felt, while genuinely uncomfortable for her to deliver, considerably more substantive than I might have initially expected given her earlier, calculated behavior. I think I got so used to getting my way through guilt and pressure that I stopped really thinking about how it actually affected other people, she admitted. I'm genuinely sorry for putting you in that position at dinner. I appreciated this acknowledgement, though I maintained realistic expectations regarding how thoroughly this single conversation might genuinely reshape years of established family dynamics and behavior patterns. Standing in our kitchen roughly a year after that devastating dinner, watching Callum prepare dinner alongside me for an upcoming family gathering we'd both genuinely, carefully planned together this time, I thought often about that specific moment I'd stood up from our dining room table and walked out into the night uncertain, in that exact moment, exactly what consequences that decision might ultimately generate for our marriage. I'd learned, throughout that entire difficult process, something genuinely important about the specific courage required to maintain reasonable boundaries even when doing so triggers immediate, significant relationship consequences, understanding that my willingness to actually leave that dinner, rather than simply capitulating to Callum's devastating public demand, ultimately created exactly the kind of undeniable clarity our marriage genuinely needed to address a pattern that had been quietly damaging our partnership for years. Our marriage, rebuilt gradually throughout that difficult year on considerably more honest, mutually respectful terms, felt genuinely stronger by the time we reached that one-year anniversary of the incident, not because that original devastating dinner hadn't mattered significantly, but because we'd worked together, deliberately and consistently, to establish genuine boundaries and mutual respect that our earlier, more comfortable but ultimately imbalanced marriage had never actually required either of us to develop. I don't regret standing up from that table and walking out that night, understanding clearly that sometimes the most powerful response to an unreasonable ultimatum isn't argument or negotiation, but simply calmly refusing to accept terms that were never actually fair to begin with, trusting that genuine partnership, if it actually exists, will ultimately prove strong enough to survive that kind of necessary, difficult clarity.